Anybody ever tell you you're not a real blacksmith because you don't do it the way they think you should be doing it? Maybe that means you work in a gas forge instead of in a coal forge or charcoal or coke or whatever they think blacksmiths are supposed to work in. For the most part, a piece of steel does not care whether it's heated in coal, coke, charcoal, propane, natural gas, pressurized diesel fuel, waste oil forge, induction heater, or by an oxy-fuel torch. What really matters is what you do with that piece of steel or iron when you get to the anvil and start forging it, because it's the forging process that really defines you as a blacksmith, not how you heat the material, nor is it the type of tool you use to forge the material with. A power hammer is still a hammer and an anvil. It just replaces a striker or 2 or 3 strikers in some shops so that this can be done in a small one-person shop. The skill still comes from the blacksmith, and the way you forge the material is still entirely up to you. The hammer shouldn't define the work for you. And really, power hammers are not all that new of an invention. The Little Giant, which is pretty much the classic blacksmith's power hammer, was invented by a German blacksmith named Mayer, who immigrated to the US back in the mid to late 1800s, and I think the first hammer that he produced for sale was in 1895. That's more than 125 years ago. But power hammers go back longer than that. I think the first big double arch steam hammer is something like 1840. Now that's the end of the fur trade period here in the US and about the time the big westward expansion and the Oregon Trail was all taking place. That's a long time ago, and that's a lot of history of blacksmiths using power hammers. And while a hydraulic press is probably newer, I don't know when those were first invented or when they first started to be adopted by blacksmiths. Although I do know there were pneumatic upsetting presses in a lot of the mining industry when mining was big in this part of the country. And those were blacksmiths working in those mining shops using those tools. So big equipment has been a part of blacksmithing for a very long time. And as long as that equipment doesn't define your work without any skill of the blacksmith, for instance, the process of drop forging is used to make modern tools quite often. And this is different than blacksmithing. These are done in a specific die. You put a specific amount of material in there, and you have an operator that controls the drop forge or the big hammer that makes these tools. And while that's a skilled job to do that, that's pretty much the only job that person's doing. They couldn't make this wrench by hand if they had to in most cases, and they probably are not the ones that made the tooling that creates the wrench. So that's a little different than blacksmithing, but using a press or a power hammer or a big belt grinder or a gas forge or an electric induction forge does not mean one is not a blacksmith. And really, I think most people who might accuse you of not being a real blacksmith probably don't spend much time in the blacksmith shop, if any at all. They're mostly basing their opinion on what Hollywood tells them or what modern video games tell them, because a lot of people's only knowledge about blacksmithing seems to come from the video game world. So if you create things through a forging process where your skill with the tools and the materials that you have on hand dictate the outcome, you can consider yourself a blacksmith, and it doesn't matter what those other people think.